Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
G'day, and welcome everyone to our first Farm Business Management webinar, responding to the shift in settings. I'm Duncan, your host for today's webinar. And over the next hour, you'll hear from two of our guest speakers. So now a brief introduction from each of your speakers. Firstly, myself, Duncan, Agribusiness Program Lead at Dairy Australia. I'm in a national role, though I'm lucky enough to live in the fantastic dairying region of the Shoalhaven on the south coast of New South Wales. I've actually spent 7 years in extension across New South Wales. In the past 3 years, I've been supporting our regional teams with their farm business performance program. So Tom, maybe over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I'm Tom Farran, a farm management consultant with Farm & Co, based in the Northern Victoria irrigation region, so the Murray Dairy region. Been doing this for about 12 years now, myself and Cameron Smith. So the big part of what we do is we deal one-on-one with farmers to try and help them with their business side of things. So analysing their business, cash flow budgeting, analysing decisions if they should buy farms, just those sorts of things. And being the region I'm in, spend a lot of time trying to help them get through tough years, it seems like in the last 20 years. But just to point out why I spend a fair chunk of my time in Northern Victoria and Southern New South Wales, I do travel reasonably widely with my work too. So most of the dairy regions in Australia.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Great to have you here today. I'd like to welcome Fiona Smith, and I'll call you Fee from here on in, as I know you better that way. Fee, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Greg. I'm a farm business consultant based out of Southwest Vic, a little bit similar to Tom in terms of the role that I play with individual farmers, assessing farm profitability, looking at strategic planning and succession planning. But I also do a lot of work across industry in terms of around the Dairy Farm Monitor program and benchmarking across the Australian industry, which means I cover all of those areas in terms of the data that I see. Plus, I also oversee tools such as Dairy Base and Farm Business Snapshot on behalf of Dairy Australia for assessing profitability.
Thanks a bunch, Fee. And again, great to have you on board. So as we all know, every farm is different in many senses, different with their goals, different resources, and of course, different climatic conditions, especially at the minute. Many regions in the south, it's excessively dry, and around home here and much of New South Wales and parts of Queensland, it's excessively wet. So therefore, each farm business operator needs to work out what the change in settings means for their farm business at present and what the best course of action is for their business. There's a need to be realistic in terms of what the settings are and keeping in mind, I guess, the big picture or the longer term plan, as well as dealing with the here and now. So Tom, I know you've got a bit of a saying that gives some context here.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So as Greg's saying, it's one of those times where every business is very unique and different. So particular between regions, this is a national webinar. And so there'll be some farms that are going to find it quite challenging the next 12 months based on the opening milk price and seasonal conditions. And there's some farms that are on multi-year contracted prices and having better seasonal conditions that are in a completely different situation about how they'll tackle this year. So the way I often think about it, and this is more put for the service providers amongst us, is that we can talk about what the average farm's going to do this year. But I always think if I was asked to go and stand in a bucket of ice cold water with one foot, put the other foot in a bucket of boiling water, on average, I should be pretty comfortable, but I don't reckon I'm feeling that great.
Tom, take us through some first steps, mate. Where do we start?
Yeah, so for most of the farm businesses, the first step really is to try and get a gauge of what it all means to them. So we've seen that all the companies come out with an opening milk price, unlike previous years where by this stage we're starting to see them review their opening milk price and step up. It's been very quiet on farm in that regard. And so most of my clients have come to the realisation that they're probably budgeting on that opening milk price as what we need to use for the budgets. So we need to get a bit of a picture of where we're at. So to start with, the biggest thing we see in these tighter years, potentially tighter years, is cash flow becomes the key thing we've got to try and look at and manage. So we often talk in the industry about profit creation and wealth creation, and they're very important, but the reality is in a really tight year, we've got to get the cash flow part. We've got to be able to manage that first and foremost. So a good starting point is to take stock of your business. So work out where you're currently at. So doing things like the dairy-based analysis now coming into the end of the financial year can really help. And what that's useful for is it can give you a pretty good picture of what your current costs and incomes are, what your milk production is, what sort of feed you're going to need, that sort of thing we've used in the past, and then converting that into a cash budget for the year ahead. So using that as your starting point and then moving and then adjusting that as we need to. So we've got a picture on the milk price. So we need to look at what will change and what won't change. And the big ones out of there is obviously milk income's a huge part of the cash budget. So we need to accurately assess what we think we're going to do for milk production. And once we've worked that out in a month-by-month sense, send that off to our milk factory, to get an income estimate to see what that will mean for income, and then do feed and water budgets as well, because they're the other, or water for the irrigation areas, because they're the other ones that have a large impact on your budget. So that's probably the key ones I'd start with, is trying to assess where you're at. And what it's actually going to mean. So, right, we've got a lower milk income, but what does that mean for particularly in a cash flow for the coming year?
And probably a bit of around those feed budgets and water budgets, a bit of sensitivity around those as well, Tom. I mean, the income estimate going with that price that you get, yep. I think always with any cash flow, generally speaking, but particularly around that feed and water stuff, sensitivity around where that price is. Keeping in mind, yes, a lot of people know what's happened with autumn. You've either had an autumn break or you had it with lots of Australia not having an autumn break. Lots of people only starting a true round at the moment. But I think there's also a lot still to play out in terms of where grain prices are going to sit across the year and where hay prices will sit as well. So part of that's around a sensitivity piece too, Tom.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely would include a sensitivity. So things like you said, the milk production, that makes a big difference. If we end up getting 5% lower production than we thought, we want to see what that actually means. And it's the same if we have a tougher seasonal conditions, we're going to buy in 10% or 20% more feed. We really need to know what that looks like in terms of how we're going to manage through that.
Yeah. And obviously fair variation in possible prices across that as well, and possible quality as well, given that a lot of people that are buying, if I look at, say, Southwest Vic in South Australia at the moment, access to feed is becoming a little bit limited anyway, but access to high quality feed is certainly becoming limited.
Yes, definitely. Yep. And as we know, some of this stuff, seasonal conditions play a big role in this as well. And that's outside our control, unfortunately.
Yep. And I think in terms of that, and I think everyone will do cash flows a little bit differently, Tom. Some people will use their historical figures out of Dairy Base, and that can actually be dropped into a cash flow tool with Dairy Australia. But I think a lot of people would also be using their accounting programs to run those cash flows. Some people using add-ons like figures, but making sure you're factoring in all the information that's in there, like things like interest rates and any projected changes that are going to come out of that as well. Yeah. And so in terms of those cash flows, Tom, do you think, if you're looking at those at the moment, and most of your clients doing a 24-25 budget, predicting the same seasonal conditions or working on a completely different set of seasonal conditions for where they're going to be for the coming year?
So I should specify that most of the clients I've been doing this so far with have been in the irrigation region of Northern Victoria. And so it depends on what their water situation, because we're in a fortunate position up here that the dams are pretty full. We're pretty well guaranteed 100% allocation. So a lot of farms are going to get that allocation. They've carried over water in various sources. So they've been lucky. They've been able to lock a part of that variability in, so they can try and not have to worry about as much. So we're not as exposed as we are in the rain-fed areas to that side of things.
Yeah. And I see it probably coming back to the concept that Greg gave at the start and that Tom, you spoke through as well, is that it will be really different circumstances for different farms depending on a lot of factors. So part of the milk price, part of seasonal conditions. Years like this can come back to, where your equity position sitting, relationships with banks for your ability to get extra cash if that's what you're needing. But I also think, Tom, you and I have had conversations about the fact that different farms will also make different decisions in the coming year. Like I've got farms who, for the past 2 years where milk price has been really strong, have probably pushed stocking rate a little bit higher. There's been, good margins in milk, so they've chosen to have more cows on, meaning that the proportion of grazed feed they've had in the diet probably been lower than what they've typically done. Higher overall milk solids production on the farm. I've got a lot of those farmers now that will pull back to what we call the sweet spot on stocking rate, because that's what will work for their system. But I know, Tom, you've certainly got some circumstances where pulling back on production actually wouldn't be the best option.
Yeah, so once we've sort of done that cash flow budget and looked at what the years ahead, it doesn't mean that has to be our final part. We can normally look and say, well, can I actually improve this? Can I make it a better outcome than what it currently is? And so we need to understand what's driving our cost base, where the issues are and where they might not be. And so as Fiona's indicated there, that some farms have built up stock numbers. It's made sense in the high milk price years to push that milk production, hence those stock numbers. And we've got to look at saying, well, now the milk prices come back a bit. Some places were paying elevated feed prices. Is there actually a margin in pushing those extra cows? Have I got to wind it back so I've got more of the cows dieted in homegrown feed and not as much purchased feed in that diet? Or in the case of, more often not in my client base, but there's no one size fits all, is that they've actually been very good at increasing their finance costs and things like that the last few years. So they've used the opportunity of good run of years and good run of milk prices to sort of invest in infrastructure and often invest in machinery and equipment and things like that. Or they might be leasing extra land or paid high prices for land, those sorts of things. And so they've essentially put in a lot of more fixed type cost into their budget. So high finance costs. So every time they sell a kilo of milk solids, a fair chunk of that has to be paid back out in just fixed costs, regardless of the number of cows they milk. And so in most of those budgets we've been doing, the worst thing they could do is actually pull back, because it means that they'll produce less milk, and every kilo of milk solids they do sell is going to have a higher chunk of finance costs or fixed type costs going out to that, and not enough left to pay for everything else. And so in most of those cases, they're not going to go and over push things, but to actually sell off extra cows or try and feed the cows less and things like that in for those guys would actually leave them worse off. They've still got a strong margin over that feed cost at the moment. It's just their fixed costs are going to cause them the grief.
So, Tom, as we were saying earlier in the opening, this is where the balance between dealing with the here and now is really important to context that with the longer-term plan for the business, right? Because you don't want to set yourself up for failure in the near future either.
Yeah. So I've been in this irrigation region since 2002. So the people with good history will know that was the first time we had a once in 1,000-year drought that happened to happen again 4 years later. So we've been pretty good at knowing tough times around here. And one lesson that always stood out time and time again for me is that the recovery process out the other side is equally important consideration. And so don't just look at this season in isolation. If your business plan is to go forward in dairying for a longer term, just be careful the decisions you make now won't impede your recovery coming out the other side. So examples of that is selling off too many cows. So we've found a lot of farms in the past can sell 10 to 20% of the herd and bounce back just fine. But once we cut deeper than 20%, it becomes much harder to rebound out the other side. So I just really want to emphasise that any decisions you make to manage this year need to think through what the consequences are going to be for the business trying to recover coming out the other side.
Yeah, just a question for you both. I'm hearing here, a strong sense of the importance of planning. Budgeting is actually a planning process too, right? So what sorts of planning do you think farmers should be doing or could be doing? And I know there's a range of DA programs in this space as well, right?
Yeah, I'll let Fee kick that one off.
Yeah, so I think we've talked a little bit about the cash flow, certainly cash flow and dairy base. So having your analysis of what the year has been, making sure that you've got the ability to do a cash flow, whether that's out of the tool that DA offers or whether that's straight out of your accounting program. Often it's quite good to run it out of your accounting program because it aligns perfectly with the way that you're sort of coding and tracking your income and expenses. And I think probably start to look at some of those other things that you can do, some of the programs around dairy farm business analysis and our FAMO plan from strategic planning point of view to look at where, things are going to go moving forward. And I think, Tom, coming back to your point about make sure you've still got track of what you're wanting to achieve longer term. Because I think, Tom, the one that we often hear in a low milk price year is, I'll just feed less. So I'll just cut back grain, I'll feed less, and then I won't have that expense. And often the unfortunate circumstance is that in that situation is it has flow-on effects to things like not only production, but things like fertility, animal health, and that doesn't necessarily just impact the year ahead. That can have long-running consequences.
Yeah, and I've certainly seen that in the past where people have underfed cows for the year and they lose a lot of condition, and then next year you get a better milk price and a larger portion of the feed you feed them goes into them putting back on the condition again. And we all know that it's not very economic to strip weight off cows just to put it back on again. Like, that's an expensive way of feeding cows.
Yeah. And I think, Tom, coming back to some of your comments about financing costs, I know that we saw, the last couple of years that we will have all seen privately with clients on farm, and that we've certainly seen out of the Dairy Farm Monitor benchmark data shows that there's been an increase in finance costs, not only because of increasing interest rates, increasing land prices, which has meant that you generally carry more debt at a higher interest rate. But we've also seen significant flow-on effect of that 100% tax write-off in terms of people with tax problems for the last few years. The accountant said, can you go and buy some more machinery? Doesn't often take a lot of pushing to get people to buy more machinery, I'd have to say.
I do sometimes wonder with that conversation if that's the accountant saying that or if that's the farmer going, can I buy more machinery?
Possibly both. We could probably make more generalisations about who's pushing that conversation for the more machinery, but we won't go there. And I think that does mean that not only from the in terms of where that's going to put people from a financing cost perspective, I think one of the things people are going to have to be really aware of in this coming year is that, as you said, Tom, the cash flow pressure. I think what a lot of people could get caught out by, particularly in the first few months of this year, is that your accountant says you're either going to have to pay tax, or you need to do a whole heap of tax planning in that we would like you to prepay a whole heap of stuff now. So they go ahead and do that to ease that pressure on the, from a tax perspective, so they don't have to pay that. But it's going to have a big cash flow impact when milk price drops, particularly when it comes to spring and people start getting some of those hay and silage bills. So I think be mindful, Tom, in terms of prepayment. What are the things that you would be saying to people, the ones that you would comfortably say go and prepay, and what to be careful of in that process?
So it's a balancing act, right, Fee? Now, just a reminder, we've got the Q&A there, so please hit us up for any specific questions that you might have. So Fee and Tom, reality is we're predicting cash flow to be tight, right? So just as a bit of a recap again, what sorts of things can we do to manage tighter cash flows? And I'm thinking about capital projects, principal repayments. Yeah, good old equipment finance, right? Those things.
Yeah, so one of the upsides we've had is with a run of better years for most farms, coming out of a run of poorer years, is we've done a lot of catching up on things, so repairing laneways, lasering country, doing all that sort of stuff, and it's been needed and necessary. But in a tight year, some of those things might need to be delayed. And so they are hard on cash flow to pay out those sorts of things. So we need to review what capital projects must be done now versus what we could wait until later. Things like talking to your bank if the cash flow is really tight. If you're on principal payments, can you go for a period of interest only? And that's going to be a case-by-case type one, that one. And then just being wary of signing up to more equipment finance and stuff like that. So making sure, do we need to replace that tractor now and have that $3,000 a month of cash flow pressure put on there, or will we get through, or in some cases repairs and maintenance costs might go up by more. So we've just got to make those decisions a bit more carefully, saying, well, what's this going to do to my cash flow position if I do this capital, if I go and buy that? And so no farmer wants to hear that message, but it is one thing we need to look at, is saying what of those can we put on pause for a while until we get to better times again. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think the other one, and you've got to be careful about doing it, but I know that we often see that in years like this, things like fertiliser, And, I think this is probably one of those years where the concept of soil testing, whilst yes, it costs to obviously do that process, go back to soil testing. If you're not needing to put on capital fertiliser, let's just go with the fert that needs to go on to grow you that homegrown feed for the year. If you can go a couple of years where fertility levels are okay and you're not needing to put that on, then this is probably one of those years where you'd hold it back. I think I had a farmer ask me yesterday about prepaying fertiliser. This is also a farmer that we've had some conversations about whether they're the company that they're supplying, that they're getting their fertiliser from, is definitely the best company. So I think in terms of prepayments, whatever you're prepaying, make sure that's not putting more pressure on your cash flows, and you want to be prepaying stuff you're actually going to use for the coming year. So prepaying things like semen, interest, feed, fert that you're going to use, that's all good. Prepaying a whole head to your farm supply storage, you're not planning on doing a whole heap of repair and maintenance, might not work. But also, if you're planning on shopping around a bit for feed and fert, be careful about making a prepayment to a company that may not have the best prices moving forward as well. So, Tom, I don't know whether you're having similar conversations with your guys about that side of things too.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot about the prepayment side of things, but the one we're definitely talking about is what not to cut out of their budget. Certainly review everything, but there's some things that will be more damaging cost to cut out because they'll cut out the farm income by greater amounts. So, for example, most farms I'm on at the moment, keep using nitrogen wisely is still a better option because that's providing a lot cheaper feed than going into the market to buy it. So, yeah, they might not want to pay the nitrogen bill, but it's going to be a smaller bill than the fodder they're going to have to go and buy instead, or the milk check that gets smaller because we haven't fed the cows as well. So there's some things we've got to be careful about not cutting because it could make us actually worse off than better. So while it's great to cut some expenses out of the budget, we've got to make sure that that's not going to cut the income by more than what the actual cost is going to be saved.
And I think the hard thing, Greg, probably for a lot of your guys in New South Wales is that, which is probably not happening across the rest of Australia. Lots of the rest of Australia at the moment is probably not having any issue cutting their nitrogen because they haven't had any rain to go on with it. But for the New South Wales guys in particular, they probably almost run into the issue again of being too wet. They put on in, it's got too wet, so it's happily disappeared again, and they'll have to kind of keep doing that same process. So, I mean, New South Wales have probably got a different set of challenges around their ability to manage those costs just because of how wet it is.
Yep, 100% agree. So just looking more towards the cow side of things, just making sure that herds are optimised as well, right? But not too many cuts, right, Tom? I know, managing this short-term versus long-term is really important, especially when it comes to young stock.
So a couple of points on the cows. I'll come to the young stock in a minute. Is when we're looking at the milking herd, there's a couple of rules that don't really matter what the year is that we should always look into. Rules are probably the wrong word. But things like you mentioned don't cut out soil testing because that couple $100 you spend on that could end up saving a lot in fertiliser costs. I always have the same view of herd testing. So if we're going to milk the cow, we've got to make sure that cow is the right one to have in the herd. And so we're talking about not culling cows deliberately because of the tight times for some farms, when that's talking about a useful, profitable cow, as opposed to a cow that you might be best off without. So still do things like herd testing to make sure you're milking the cows that are all worthwhile milking. And then the other one, in young stock, it's been a common trend I've seen. I'm not sure if it's in every region, but most of the farms I deal with in a couple of different regions, young stock. So we have a nice heifer calf born, and so we rear it. And in the past, we've then milked some of them and we've sold some to the export markets, and it's all been working quite well. But we're in most farms in a situation now where they've got more young stock coming through than they need. And it's very expensive to rear young stock. Like it costs a lot, and particularly if you're having a tough seasonal condition and buying in vetch and stuff like that for them, we could be talking by the time you rear that calf and it gets into the herd, you might be well north of $2,000. So you want to be pretty confident you need that cow at the other end because there's a fair chance you won't sell it for what you've spent on her. And so things like that need to be carefully reviewed. How many young stock do I actually need, and what am I going to do with them? And the saying goes with the dairy beef crosses. So that's been quite popular to rear them. And 2 years ago, there was good extra money in it. I I was just at a dairy network group earlier this week, and one of the farms said that I just kept on with that plan, and I've lost 40 grand in that operation with about 100 head he was talking about. So it's cost him 40 grand more to do it than what he's actually made out of it. And so once again, if you're going to go that way, you probably want to look into those markets the other end. It's probably not the year to take a gamble, because it does really, we're often very good at hiding some of those costs of rearing heifers, rearing beef crosses and stuff like that in amongst all the other costs, but it is a real cash flow drain on the business. So we want to be pretty confident that we're going to get something worthwhile at the other end of it. So be confident on those markets, be confident we actually need that heifer at the other end.
And I think probably that the added complexity to that, and Tom, I wouldn't say that story's unique. Same thing, I had a discussion group yesterday in that conversation about, rearing extra, often the dairy beef cross. Beef looked like it was good a couple of years ago. It did look good a couple of years ago, given I'm on a beef farm. It doesn't look so good anymore. I think, making sure that you're making those decisions about young stock, some of the added complexity of what we've got coming into the year ahead is that a lot of people are still sitting there coming into a joining period and wondering, are we still hoping for an export market to come back? Are we trying to get like a Wagyu contract? Are we hoping to avoid the bobby calves, market completely? So I think that's the added complexity that some people have got around that shifting settings of what are we doing with those young stock? And, what market is there for that in terms of how we're going to get rid of those animals and what they'll offer to the cash flow as well, which is just one of those other ones that kind of has to be managed.
Yeah, and I think that, Fiona, I'd just like to add that about what we call the sunk cost fallacy. So we've got to be careful, because a lot of farms have spent a fair bit of money getting that heifer to 15 months of age or whatnot. And so they don't want to accept that I've just spent $2,000 or $1,500 and it's only worth $500. But unfortunately, we can't do anything to go back and change any of that. All we can do is look at, as of today, what's our best decision going forward. So if I keep putting money into this cow I don't really need, how much am I going to spend and what's it going to gain me at the other end? Or am I better off going, well, if I get $500 today and don't have to spend another couple of hundred, is that actually a better outcome? So we need to, it's really tricky and hard to do, much easier said than done, but we've got to forget about what it's cost us or what it's happened to this point and say, as of today, what is the best decision that we can make going forward?
Absolutely.
And so, Tom, I know you like your partial budgets. I think you've got a marginal cow exercise for us.
Yeah, so just explain what we mean by partial budget. So we talked about cash flow budgets before, so we're looking at the whole business, all the income, all the expenses. I think it's important when we've done that exercise to then look at what we could change and what difference it'll make. So when we do that in a whole budget context, it's pretty clunky and slow to do. And I like it's often the thought process behind it's the important part. So if we do a partial budget, we're just simply looking at what changes. So if we do this, what extra income we're going to get and what actual costs change. So is that a good decision in its own right? So for example, if we looked at the marginal cow, so what we mean by that is if I milked one more cow, I've got to go through and say, well, what extra income would I get? So I'd get the milk income from her. Got to be realistic about it, because the chances are that extra cow we milk's not the average cow. So if we're typically to do 600 kilos of milk solids a year for the average, that particular cow we're talking about is probably not doing that. So we've got to be realistic around what it's doing, what other income we might have. So there's probably a 50% chance she gets a heifer calf. What would that be worth? What would a bull calf be worth? And what's it worth if she doesn't get in calf? And then we'll also then look at what costs change. So the big one's going to be the feed cost example. So we're going to have to feed that cow. There's a very high chance that the current herd's going to eat all the grass we've got without that cow. So if we milk that extra cow, sure enough, she'll eat some of the grass, but it means that the other cows have to eat more hay. So we'll assume that she needs all bought-in feed. So we've got to be realistic about that. So she might have 2 tonne of grain. She might need 4 or 5 tonne of hay. So we've got to put that cost in there. We look at things like, well, what else changes? Yeah, we'll try and get her in calf, we'll drench her, we'll vaccinate her, so our herd costs are going to go up. And if we typically spend $200 a cow on herd costs, she'll probably also cost $200 per cow. So we'll put that in the cost category. We might look at saying shed costs, so that's like electricity and like detergents, type teat spray, that sort of thing, going, if I milk that extra cow and it's typically cost me $100 a cow to shed cost, will it cost me another $100 for her? probably not, because we're already washing the dairy and stuff like that. So we might say, oh, it's probably $30. So we'll have an estimate on that and never sweat the small stuff. So if it's $30 or $35, it's not going to make much difference to our decision. And so we keep going through and saying what's going to change, what's going to not change. Labour is another one. If I milk her, am I going to pay more for labour or one extra cow, and the labour would stay exactly the same? So we've got to look at that and make that decision, and it's going to be different for each farm. And so it's just really going through and looking at what changes, what doesn't, and therefore we can make a decision saying, if I milk that extra cow, does that improve the budget or does it make it worse? And that's what we're trying to really work out. And as I said, it's different for every farm. And we've got to look at other bigger picture stuff like infrastructure. So if I milk a couple more cows, does that then mean that some of the cows have to stand out in the laneway because they can't fit in the yard? All those sorts of things. The common sense checks still need to be applied.
Perfect. And before we jump into the labour piece, we actually do have a question for either you, Tom, or Fee. It's from Luke, and it's he's looking for a comment on cutting back on grain feeding, with the sense that grain mix around 50 to 55 cents a kilo, with a milk price about 58 cents per litre he's got here. How can he evaluate that sort of marginal milk response or drop from changing grain feeding? So I think you've kind of touched on it a little through your partial budget exercise.
And I think, Tom, I think a lot of people would use a margin over feed cost, like Tom, I assume you probably have a spreadsheet that you use that is a margin over feed cost calculation for that. And keeping in mind, you've got to be a little bit careful about the margin that you're looking for over that feed cost to ensure you're not missing out on some of the other things that need to be covered as part of that. I think I would still be very conscious, though, that whatever you're cutting out this year will not only impact this year, but it will impact the following year as well. So whilst you want to try and make sure that you've got cash flow this year, I think you've got to be careful. I mean, if you try and pull out a significant amount of grain out of your cow, we're going to run into the issues that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, so it's an impossible one for me to answer in a generic sense, as in there's so many variables in this one. And so some things to consider, like if a farm's currently feeding 2 kilograms of grain a day and they go to 3 kilos, there's a fair chance they're going to get quite a good response from that kilo of grain, and hence they'll get a big enough margin to make it worthwhile. If they're already feeding 9 kilos and they go to the 10th kilo, there's a fair chance the response is going to be a lot lower. And so it's going to be an individual farm case by case. And why I also look at spreadsheets and stuff like that as a starting point, there's nothing that can beat observation to try and work some of this stuff through. So often we experiment and say everything's fairly stagnant on the farm, same number of cows, so say going to a similar type of grass each day, get that extra kilo of grain, see what happens. See, does it pay for itself or not? We know the cost of the grain. Do we pick up enough extra milk? And sometimes it could be also used as a tool to help manage pastures and stuff. So we know if we overgrow pastures, we're going to grow less for the next feed. And so if it helps maintain our residuals and stuff like that. So it sounds like a simple question, but unfortunately it's quite complex. It can be worked out on an individual farm, but unfortunately I can't just say yes or no. It's not a yes or no answer in a generic sense. Yeah, which I know no one likes that answer, but
thanks a bunch, Luke, for your questions. So let's chat about labour. It's a vexed area, isn't it? Labour is expensive, but at the same time, it's necessary. What's your collective thoughts?
Tom, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. So one of the things, and I've had this comment made a few times. I've been spending a little bit of time down the southwest, like when I say the southwest Victoria, I'm talking of late. And some of the comments I've heard there is around it's going to be pretty tough. I'm going to cut back on my labour. And so it's a case by case situation, but we've got to be careful around that. There's a couple of things to think about. I remember when I first got into dairy farming, switching over from sheep, someone once told me that one of the most important things, what makes a good dairy farmer versus an average one, is often timing. There's normally less than a 2-week window where the thing's got to happen. And so if we're stretching labour and our timing starts to go out of whack and things aren't getting done when they're meant to, the lost production, lost income or extra cost replacing that lost production can be a lot higher than what the labour cost saving can be. And the other one I see is if people get worn out, burnt out, and spread too thin, their decision-making often isn't as good as it could be. So, and there's endless studies that have been done on this, and I see it in real life all the time. Saving 50 grand on labour or something on a reasonable scale farm, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of dollars of poor decisions they might make as a result. So if you've got excess labour and you really don't need it, well, that's a different question, saying, am I cutting too fine? And if I do, what are the consequences? Can the farm run as profitably? And can I be as effective as a manager on those lower labour? That's not to say that we shouldn't look at the way we're doing things to see if we can't be more labour efficient. Because I think as an industry, we've been very good, particularly in the last couple of years, of designing ways to produce more milk and more this and more that. And this is a great way of feeding the cow, a great way of doing that, and never factoring in the labour that goes into it. And so, we'll milk 2 herds instead of 1. And you're like, there's benefits in that, but does it outweigh the extra labour and stuff like that? And so they're just lots of examples. So certainly try and be more efficient with labour, but don't cut too hard is my general advice, because it'll end up costing you more than you save.
And I think this is one of those years where, and it's a concept that you find all the time when you ask farmers how much time they spend working in their business versus on their business. Most farmers say that they're very good at working in their business and not particularly good at working on their business. And I think in hard times, you'd say the same, Tom, in droughts and great sort of really what it is in New South Wales, that often when things are tighter from a cash flow perspective, people do spend more time working in the business, partly because of that labour piece. Whereas actually, in fact, the time spent on your business in a year like this will actually possibly have the bigger impact on cash flow. Your ability to do that planning about shopping around, whether it's for, your vet drivers, whether it's for your farm supplies, shopping around for fertiliser, for grain, those things might be the ones that actually give you the ability to improve that cash flow position. And if you cut back on starch, your ability to actually assess what's happening in the business in terms of cash flow could actually have a more adverse impact than getting rid of that start member.
Getting the balance right is the key.
Yeah. And I think part of that also comes back, the other thing I was going to say earlier, Greg, is that a lot of this comes back to that concept of not necessarily around key performance indicators, but the resilience tower. There's not a right or wrong for each business about what's going to work for the coming year. There is no 101 about how everyone's going to make a great outcome out of this year. So it's about balancing up the circumstances you've got. And I think the resilience tower that John Mulvaney, prepared, this is a good year to look at some of that. If your finance costs really are impacting one side of your business, what else can you do to try and balance that out this year? Yeah.
So again, before we move into the next section, which is focused more on management, again, I'm hearing this sense of the importance of planning, right? So planning for taxation, just an action plan for the business. It's really a critical step just to know where you're at and to know when the settings change too, right, Tom? Because plans are meant to change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're at a critical part of the year now to start doing some planning. So we've got a milk price, we've got a fair indication what that's going to be. And we're seeing in some parts of the country they're in tough seasonal conditions. Maybe I'm optimistic, but potentially that can improve reasonably quickly come the springtime. And so we might need to reassess again then. So we've got a couple of key times a year we look at that. So at the change of the financial year, and then during spring, we often need to review it. And then again in the late summer, early autumn. And so we've got to keep tinkering with these plans. They're not set and forget. But in saying that, one thing I've learned from too many tough years is that one of the worst parts about when things aren't looking as good is the stress of trying to make a decision, making a plan. And then often, once you've got that plan in place, you say, right, this is how we're going to tackle this year. This is how many cows we're going to milk. This is the feed we're going to get. Having that plan and putting it into practice often takes a fair chunk of the actual mental stress out of it, even if it's not a great financial outcome. Once you've got an idea of how you're going to get through it and how it's going to be done, really is very helpful. So decision paralysis on these sorts of things can make the problem a lot worse. So we've got partial information at the moment, so it's better to work off that and make a plan than wait for the perfect information and then we're too late to implement the plan.
Yeah, I agree. And Fee, I've heard you say words to the effect of done is better than perfect because perfect is never done when it comes to planning, right? So similar sense, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there aren't that many people that say they get it perfect all the time anyway. And I think particularly in a year like this, I think planning will definitely be the key to this year. I think really good communication, not that good communication isn't always required, but I think this will be one of those years where communication with your accountant, which hopefully a lot of that will be an upfront thing. I think communication for a lot of people this year with their banks will be key. Try and make sure you're working with banks, despite what some people might think. Banks do actually want to be there to support you and to work with you, but they can only do what they can with the information they've got. The earlier you are at getting information to them, the easier it is for them to actually do something about that. And I think keep communication open in the farming business. We often talk about, hear about the operational person who's out on the farm making the decisions, and then you've got a person who's controlling the financial side of things. This will be the year where you want to actually be communicating between those two sides of the business and not just appearing with a shiny piece of equipment halfway through the year that hasn't necessarily been discussed. This might not be the year to do that.
Yep. No one likes surprises, right, Fee?
Yeah, the final thing, on planning, I was going to say is that planning's all great. We've got to be quite realistic with the assumptions we're making as well. And so another part of intricacy of human nature is that when things are looking like they're getting worse, we always, like when things are looking bad, we always think they're going to get worse. It's just how we're wired. And just like 2 years ago when we got a record milk price, we're pretty wired to think we're only going to get better from here. And the reality is we're either near the top or the bottom of the cycle. And so it's likely to start going the other way anytime soon. And so we've got to be realistic as well. So we don't want to be too pessimistic in our decision-making right now because it could cost us big time, but we've got to be realistic as well.
And I think that's probably part of the piece around the bank. It might only be that you need an extension on an overdraft for a period of time while you're, cash flow short for a few months, with the view that, as you say, Tom, coming out next year, seasonal conditions might shift as well, so that people actually get an autumn break to go with the possibility of changing in commodity prices. So just making sure you're prepared for all of those different circumstances.
Yeah, good stuff. Good advice. So now just focusing a little more on the operational management side of things, Tom and Fiona. Just getting the basics right, like grazing management. Tom, what's some keys to consider here?
Yeah, so often one of the things that can get forgotten when we're getting stressed about the bigger picture, the bigger settings type thing, is how important getting the day-to-day parts right can really be. And so grazing management, so being on the best rotation that we could be on, looking after our grazing residuals, all those things can help us grow a lot more feed, so hence keep us out of the purchase feed market more. So we know the difference between a person grazing well or someone's grazing too fast. They might actually grow 50% less feed, and the only difference is the management. It's not the cost structure of doing it. And so things like grazing management are absolutely key. Looking at nitrogen management, and so I was a bit surprised the other day at a discussion group how much people had forgotten about nitrogen management, and they were spreading the whole farm in one go. So just getting back to the basics of, if we put nitrogen out, what's the best rate to put out, and how long do we need to leave it before we put the cows on it? Just those real basics, and all that information is quite readily available if people aren't sure on any of that. The other one is feeding the cows to the most profitable level. So just trying to make that, and as I said, that's a daily decision. So should we feed them a bit more? Should we feed them a bit less? And how's that going to influence later on? So condition score. If we underfeed the cows today, does that mean they're going to overgraze at pasture, and hence we grow less grass for next time? So we need to feed them more or get lower milk production. So there's all those sorts of ones. Another key one, as I mentioned earlier, is herd testing. So making sure that each cow we're milking is the right cow to be milking. Make sure we don't have too many passengers in the herd. Unfortunately, it's probably not a good year to be that pet cow. That pet cow's probably going to get scrutinised a bit more than it might have otherwise. And as we mentioned, the other ones, like just be realistic about the stock we actually need. So that's talking about the young stock and the beefies. making sure that it is actually going to be worthwhile rearing them, because it is a big drain on the cash of the business to do it.
But I know you've got a lot of your guys keep a very close eye on their level of supplements. How do they ensure that they're optimized or in the right zone, that they're profitable? What sorts of things are they doing?
Yeah, look, a lot of them are looking at the historical performance of the business. So looking at production efficiency of cost-effective feeding. So looking at things that like their kilos of milk solids on, as a percentage of live weight off that diet. I think a lot of them in a tighter year will start to do more of that margin over feed cost. I think, Tom, coming back to your comment about, coming back to the basics of nitrogen management and feed management, I think the last few years with milk prices being higher, there haven't been as many people going back to those tools and that marginal decision making, because there's been margins there that they could take without necessarily having to go to that level. So I think this year will be that year. And I think, Greg, I probably talked a bit at the start, a lot of, the guys that I'm working with in pasture-based systems, because we've got to be careful that whilst I also see PMR and TMR, so partial mixed ration and total mixed ration systems, most of the clients I work with tend to be in that grazing space, really focusing on that ton of dry matter directly grazed down the cow's throat. But same thing, coming back to Tom's point, not then impacting the productivity of the cow based on pulling back on too many of the other supplements. But I think this will be the year where they really start to focus on coming back to some of those key basics around productivity of cost-effective feeding. Yeah. This will be the year they come back to that. Yeah.
Gotcha. And Tom, just so back to sort of young stock and maybe beefies and that sort of stuff too, right? Just really assessing the necessity to have those animals around, or maybe what the end market is as well, right?
Yeah. And it's, I don't know bones about it. It's a tough situation at the moment because we've got the bobby calf discussion going on as well. And so most farms I deal with understandably don't really want to be selling 5-day-old calves off to slaughter anymore, so they'd much rather be rearing them and make use of them. But unless they've got the end market sorted, it could be quite expensive to do that. So we've just got to weigh that up. And so, like, if you work out, well, I've got to pull milk out of the vat or buy milk powder in and feed those ones, it's like most times to rear a beef cross just to get it to like that 100, 120 kilos. A lot of farms are well over $300, if not $400 a calf just to get to that stage. Yeah, if you went and tried to sell that in the open in the sale yards at the moment, I don't know, it might be worth $200 at best. And so we've just got to be a little bit careful with how much we spend on it and, just make sure we've got that end market. Some farms are starting to find end markets for it now through various ways. And so they've got some sort of guaranteed price or at least a price range at the end. But yeah, I'd be very wary advising anyone to rear them at the moment if they don't have an idea what the end market's likely to be.
And Fee, what are your clients thinking and doing just around managing the passengers?
Oh, look, I'd say very similar to Tom. There's probably some that are, and probably some on this webinar that are currently going out to work out how they can find a pet cow. But I think I agree. I think this will be the year where people really need to be focused on who you're keeping that feed for. Who are you best to be feeding in a year like this? But I do think that I think it would be naive to think that that's even an easy decision to make. I agree, Tom, about the concept of don't carry any passengers this year, both in the herd. I think this is probably one of those years that where people might have been rearing up to, on send funds that are rearing up to 35% replacements on rising ones and rising twos. This is probably the year where you're saying, okay, maybe we are coming back to that typical 25%, replacement so that you're not carrying that extra cost coming into the following year. Doesn't necessarily limit you in the following year, particularly if you haven't pulled back your cow numbers a lot, but means you're not carrying those surplus animals that take on a lot of cost. And I think in terms of that, the dairy beef and what's happening with those other animals, you don't want to carry passengers, but that's not taking aside away from the fact that that can be quite a hard decision to make. And there are a lot of people that are trying to, be forward thinking in that front and doing something with that. But as you say, Tom, you've got to have an end market to be able to retain one's animals this year. Yeah.
Yep. So just one I've just been seeing a lot lately, Greg, or hearing a lot about is young stock on adjustment too. Just wanted to make sure everyone is checking those, because I've had 2 or 3 farmers lately that are coming back. They're coming too light to actually join, so they're having to change calving patterns based on how undergrown some of their adjustment heifers are and how quickly they've shrunken, which we know that cows don't actually shrink, just means code for they haven't checked them for a long time. So and it just comes back to what I said before about that sunk cost fallacy. Like, we've just got to look at that undersized heifer that's too small to join and say, if I now rear for an extra 6 months and calve her later, is that actually she ever going to pay her way back? Or if I've got 35% replacement rates, am I better off actually just quitting some of those, even though they won't be worth much?
Yeah, look, spot on. And I think a timely comment there from Julie Moore, indicating that only 2 years ago, some of those red carbs for them were reaching 1,100 and are now down to 600 at best, right? So again, assess your position right, Tom and Fee, and know what market you're shooting for.
Yeah. And I think, we've also got to be realistic in saying that, if people do go for the option of reducing, people sell the passengers plus reduce stock numbers, I think, Tom, that's where you do have to be aware that it will have to be a different frame of mind to say we might actually lose money on those animals if we take it as a clear cut, what she cost me, what am I selling her for? But in terms of what the cost will be if you keep them, because chances are those prices might not come back up. I think that's the hard thing. We're certainly not saying that we don't recognise that you won't necessarily get exactly what you want for it. And Julie, definitely take on your point. 2 years ago, you were getting a lot more money. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be retaining those animals this year. It just have to be one of those years where you look at, well, what does that do to my cash flow moving forward? Keeping in mind that those animals will also give you that cash flow injection from livestock sales.
Yeah, so I think we just got to keep in mind that unfortunately we can't go back in time. We just got to make the decision from here we are today, what is the best path forward, and forget about what it's cost us to get to this point.
Yep, perfect. So we've covered a fair bit of ground, but as far as what else is concerned, coming up, it goes without saying, reach out to Dairy Australia's regional teams. They are on the ground delivering value. So if you have questions, comments, or looking for further information about the range of things we've discussed already, please reach out to someone on the regional teams. Obviously, dairyaustralia.com.au. There's a range of business resources and tools and resources across the Dairy Australia website. Even just a quick Google, things like Farm Business Snapshot and Dairy Base. We've heard them mentioned by both Tom and Fee already today. Good place to start. Fee, there's a couple of handy little add-ons in the Dairy Base section around budgeting as well, isn't there?
Yeah. So the beauty of Dairy Base, once you've got data in there, is that you can actually pick any of the historical years. And I think, Tom, probably for a lot of your Northern Vic guys, they can almost take, the year that we're about to finish and use that for running a budget. I think for some of the farmers that I'm working with in, say, Southwest and some for Gippsland would probably be picking out a historical year that is more in line in terms of seasonal conditions for what we're seeing for the year ahead. And you can adjust things like your milk price, feed prices, fertiliser and livestock sales and water prices, which will give you the ability to have a comparatively quick look at what that end cash position is going to be. And really, that's a great starting point to then start the process of saying, okay, what can we change and what do we need to change to make sure that we're in a better position from a cash perspective for the rest of the year.
Perfect. So if you would like to know a little bit more or enhance your farm business management decision-making skills, look for a range of the face-to-face or online extension opportunities. Jump on the DA website, look for the events calendar, look at your RDP newsletters and social media for what's coming up. Our Farm Out Plan commencing on the 7th of August with Kath Jenkins, really to help you turn those challenges and ideas and opportunities and options into a plan for your own farm business. We can also do engagement-led Our Farm, Our Plan. So reach out to anyone in your regional teams to see if they can come out and sit down with you for an engagement-led Our Farm, Our Plan. And of course, our mainstay, our Farm Business Fundamentals National Online course will run in the next couple of months. So just closing that off, Tom and Fee, we've covered a lot of ground. Have we got a few final thoughts for participants to leave this webinar today? What sorts of things do you think they need to take home?
Yep. So I think the starting point for all the farm businesses is to assess their situation. So put together that cash flow budget to actually see what it's going to mean, these changing settings. Work out a plan once you've done that. So how are you actually going to tackle the season? Being very mindful of we're trying to get through this season with the best outcome as possible, but leaving the business in a position that it can recover out the other end. So don't make decisions that are going to dig the business into a hole coming out the other side. Focus on the basics. We should be doing this every year, so it's just a reminder. So e.g. pasture management. And the other one we probably haven't spoken about as much, and hopefully someone will jump in with this one a bit more stronger, is look after yourself. So like not only for your mental health side of it, but your business will perform better if you're performing better.
Perfect, Tom. And Fee, your sense?
Yeah, look, probably not a lot more to add from Tom's perspective. I think getting in early, so that making sure you've got those income estimates, making sure that you've got those cash flows ready to go and that everyone's having that conversation. So I think it does come back to the communication piece. Don't just do a cash flow and forget to, probably share it with the rest of the business management team working this on farm, which can also happen. Often in years like this, critical people within a business will retain stuff within their head and take on a lot of the load. And probably, Tom, coming back to your point, I think this is a year where we need to, make sure people are looking after each other and themselves, and where that communication is kept open so that one person in the business doesn't think they've got to take all of that on themselves. Yeah, and open communication. This is one of those years where it's better to have those phone calls earlier with your bank and with suppliers if you need to say, look, we might not be able to make the payment this month. Can we make it next month? Better to get on the front foot to have that communication.
Absolutely perfect. Well, I think that wraps us up, Tom and Fee. We've got no further questions. Really appreciate your time, Tom and Fee, and your experience. And fingers crossed we see less rain up north and a little bit more rain in the south. Fingers crossed that helps. Have a great day. See you at the next one.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.